At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, a text message arrived on my phone that was never meant for me. For words long. Wrong chat. Ignore that. I read the message above it once, then twice, then a third time, and by the fourth reading I understood something my husband of 20 years did not yet know I understood. That everything I had built with my own 2 hands for 2 decades was about to be quietly handed to someone else, unless I moved first. What I did in the 11 days that followed is the reason my husband can no longer hear my name without flinching. My name is Priya Malhotra. I am 45 years old. I built a 14-location restaurant company out of a 600-square-foot noodle counter in Flushing, Queens, and I want to tell you exactly how I found out that the man I trusted with my whole life had been planning to walk away with the parts of it he never actually owned. This is that story. Stay with me until the end because the way it finishes is not the way you're going to think it finishes. I need to take you back 20 years first, because you can't understand how deep a betrayal cuts until you understand how much trust it had to travel through to reach you. I met Aaron Reyes when I was 24 years old, fresh out of business school with a head full of spreadsheets and a grandmother's recipe book that I had carried across 3 moves and 1 ocean. My grandmother had run a small restaurant in Jaipur for 30 years, and when she passed she left me 2 things: a leather-bound notebook of recipes written in her looping handwriting, and a single piece of advice I didn't fully understand until much later in my life. She told me in Hindi that a kitchen has 1 owner even when 2 people are cooking in it. Aaron was charming in the specific way that certain men are charming, not loud, not obvious, but warm, attentive, the kind of person who remembered your coffee order after hearing it once and made you feel in any room like you were the only person worth talking to. He didn't come from money. He didn't come from much of anything, honestly, and I think that's part of why I fell for him. He had hunger. He wanted to build something, and when he looked at my grandmother's recipes and said, "We could actually do something with this," I believed him completely. We opened our first location together when I was 25. 600 square feet for tables, a counter, and a lease that neither of our families could afford to co-sign, which is how Denise Okonkwo entered the story. My mother's oldest friend, a woman who had built her own fortune in commercial real estate over 30 years and had, by that point, exactly 0 patience for men who thought charisma was collateral. "I'll back you," Denise told me over coffee. "Not him. You understand the difference." I did not, at 25, fully understand the difference. I understand it now. Aaron and I got married in year 3 of the business. By then we had 3 locations and a small write-up in a local paper that called us the young couple reinventing New York noodle culture. A headline Aaron kept framed in his office for the next 17 years. I did the operations. I did the numbers. I signed the leases because in the early years, banks simply would not extend credit to Aaron without my name attached. A fact that at the time felt like a formality and would later feel like the single most important detail of my entire adult life. Aaron did the front of house. He did the interviews, the openings, the ribbon cuttings, the handshakes with the mayor's office when we opened our 10th location in the Bronx. He was good at it. Genuinely good, not just charming but talented, with an instinct for hospitality that I never had and never pretended to have. For 17 years I told myself we were a perfect match. I was the architecture. He was the light that made people want to walk inside. By the time we reached 14 locations across 3 states, I was 45 years old, and I had stopped questioning the shape of our marriage the way you stop questioning the weight of a coat you've worn every winter for 2 decades. It fits. It's just there. You don't think about it until the night it's suddenly gone. That I was in my office on the 2nd floor of our flagship location in Flushing, the original 600-square-foot space that we'd expanded twice and that I still refused to give up, going over quarterly numbers the way I did every Tuesday night after close. Somebody in our marriage had always been the person reviewing quarterly numbers on a Tuesday night, and by year 17 it had stopped being a question of whose turn it was. It was simply mine. My phone buzzed on the desk at 11:47 p.m. I almost didn't look. I want you to understand that detail because it matters. I almost let that message pass by unread, the way I'd let 1,000 small red flags pass by unread over the years, telling myself I was too tired, too busy, too committed to a version of my marriage that required me not to look too closely. I looked. Wrong chat. Ignore that. I scrolled up to see what it was correcting. The message above it had been sent 9 minutes earlier, to a contact saved simply as M. "Once the Miami lease closes it's just me and you, promise." She'll get the 2 locations in Jersey and think that's generous. I sat completely still. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't what I expected to feel and it might not be what you expect either. I did not cry. I did not feel the floor tilt beneath me the way people describe in movies. What I felt was a kind of stillness, the specific quiet that settles over a kitchen in the half-second before a fire alarm goes off, when your body already knows something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. I read the message a fourth time. She'll get the 2 locations in Jersey and think that's generous. Me. He was talking about giving me 2 locations out of 14, and expecting me to think that was generous. As if the company were a gift he had the standing to give. I did not call him. I did not text back. I put the phone face down on my desk, finished the quarterly numbers I'd been working on, because 17 years of running restaurants had taught me that the work does not stop simply because your life is quietly ending around you. And then I drove home to a house where my husband was already asleep, breathing evenly, looking as he always did, like a man with absolutely nothing to hide. I lay next to him for 6 hours that night without sleeping. I did not do the useless kind of math, the how could he math that just spins in place, burning fuel for nothing and getting nowhere. I did the other kind of math. The kind I had actually built a career on. What is legally mine? What is legally his? What is shared? And who exactly is M? In the morning I made him coffee the way I had made it for 17 years. Oat milk, 1 sugar, poured before he even asked. I asked about his flight to the supplier conference in Miami, which he'd mentioned the week before, an ordinary work trip that I now understood was not entirely about suppliers. I kissed him goodbye at the door. I have thought about that kiss more times since than I care to admit, not because I regret giving it, but because it was the last kiss I ever gave him without knowing exactly what I was doing. Every kiss after that morning was a decision, not a habit. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I called Denise. I need everything, I told her. Every lease, every LLC filing, every signature page. Today if you can get it. What happened, Priya? I'll tell you when I understand it myself. By noon I was sitting across a conference table from Marcus Wilkins, the soft-spoken attorney who had drafted our original operating agreement 15 years earlier and who, it turned out, remembered every clause of it far better than either Aaron or I did. He spread the documents across the table one by one, and every sentence out of his mouth felt like a window opening in a room I had believed had no windows left to open. Here is a truth about building something with a person you trust completely. You stop reading the fine print. You assume the fine print doesn't matter between 2 people who love each other. That was my mistake. It turned out to be Aaron's mistake too, in a way that would eventually work entirely in my favor. Wilkins walked me through it point by point. The trademark on our company name, mine, registered in my name alone, back in year 2 of the business, before Aaron and I were even married, back when I did not yet trust him fully with anything financial, a decision I had once felt a flicker of guilt about and now, sitting in that conference room, silently thanked my 25-year-old self for making. The core lease is on 11 of our 14 locations, mine personally guaranteed because in the earliest years no bank would extend credit to Aaron alone, and somewhere in the long climb from 3 locations to 14 nobody had ever gone back and added his name. The supplier contracts and the master LLC controlled 62% by me, 38% by him, a split we had settled on back when Denise first invested and had simply never revisited because for 17 years we'd never had a single reason to think about who technically controlled what. I want to pause the story here for a second because this is usually the part people ask me about afterward, the moment the quiet one turns out to be the dangerous one. If you're the kind of person who likes stories like that, go ahead and hit subscribe now because the next part is where things really start moving. What Aaron actually held, on paper, after 17 years of building this company alongside me, was almost nothing. A minority stake in the LLC. A management title with no controlling authority attached to it. A name on the marketing materials because his face photographed better than mine in press photos. A fact we had accepted years ago without either of us ever discussing what it actually meant about where the real power in our partnership sat. He had built an entire second life on the quiet assumption that the company was ours in some vague, married people sort of way, the kind of assumption you make when you've never once had a reason to check. Why would he check? He trusted me completely. And that, I would come to realize over the following days, was the single most insulting part of the entire discovery. Not the affair itself. The fact that betraying me had never once required him to actually think about me, or about what he stood to lose. I found out who M Was 2 days later, and I have to be honest with you about something because I think it's important to the story. I expected to hate her before I ever learned her name. I had already built an entire narrative in my head, the way you do when your imagination is the only tool you have left. I pictured someone young, a hostess from the Miami location, maybe 28 years old, dazzled by Aaron's easy laugh and his tailored jackets, too new to the world to know any better. I had already prepared in advance a very specific kind of contempt for this imaginary young woman. I was saving it the way you save good china for company. Her name was Marisol Ferreira. She was 43 years old. She was not a hostess. She was the commercial real estate broker who had found us the Miami space in the first place, 8 months earlier, back when Aaron told me he was handling the expansion himself, and I, trusting him completely, had let him. When I finally looked into it, quietly, carefully, through a contact of Denise's who worked in commercial real estate circles across the eastern seaboard, I learned something that reorganized the entire shape of the betrayal in my mind. Marisol was not a woman Aaron had swept off her feet with charm she'd never encountered before. She was a woman who had done almost the exact same math I was now doing just 3 weeks earlier from the opposite side of the ledger. What does Aaron Reyes actually control, and how much of it can I get access to? The answer she had apparently been given, presumably by Aaron himself, in some late-night phone call full of the same confident warmth he'd used on me for 17 years, was, all of it, eventually. She'll get the Jersey locations and think that's generous. Something in me shifted when I fully understood that. Not sympathy for Marisol. She had made her choices with her eyes wide open, and I have no interest in absolving her of them. But a colder, clearer understanding of my husband settled over me. He had not simply fallen into an affair the way people sometimes stumble into things they didn't plan. He had sold one. He had made promises to a woman he barely knew about a company he did not legally control, using a confidence he had no real right to, because in his experience confidence had always been enough. It had certainly always been enough with me. I had let it be enough for 17 years. Not anymore. Here is exactly what I did with the 11 days before Aaron came home from Miami, believing he had quietly secured his future. Day 1. I had Wilkins formally document the 62/38 ownership split that had technically existed on paper the entire time but had never once been enforced in practice. Buried in the original agreement, one Aaron had signed in year 2 without reading past the signature page, because at the time he was far more interested in the launch party for our 4th location, was a clause stating that any new lease signed under the company name required majority holder sign-off. I had Wilkins formalize it, cleanly, quietly, with nothing that would raise a flag if Aaron happened to glance at company paperwork before I was ready. Day 3. I had the Miami lease, the one Aaron was actively finalizing without my knowledge, quietly flagged by a contact of Denise's at the leasing office, pending additional documentation. Nothing dramatic. No red banners, no rejected applications. Just enough sand in the gears to slow the process without anyone suspecting a hand was on the machine at all. Day 5. I met individually with our senior kitchen managers across all 14 locations, framed publicly as a routine operational check-in, the kind I did twice a year anyway. I wasn't checking on the food. I was quietly confirming the internal reporting structure at every location, and adjusting exactly 2 lines of it so that, moving forward, payroll authorization for all 14 locations routed through my office instead of splitting between us the way it had for years. Nobody noticed the change. Nobody was supposed to. Day 8. I called our accountant and had every joint account we shared that touched company funds reviewed line by line going back 3 full years. This is how I found the $140,000 that had moved in small careful increments, disguised as consulting fees and architectural sourcing costs, into an account that eventually, through 2 intermediary accounts, reached Marisol Ferreira. Day 10. Aaron called me from Miami, his voice warm and easy, exactly like every other phone call in 17 years of marriage. He told me the trip had gone well. He told me he missed me. He told me, and I remember this specific line because I wrote it down word for word the second we hung up, that he thought this Miami thing is really going to secure things for us long term. I let that word sit in my chest for a moment, turning it over the way you'd examine a stone you found on a beach, not yet sure whether it was worth anything or just another rock. I can't wait to hear all about it, I told him, and I meant every word of it, though not in the way he understood. Day 11. Aaron flew home. He walked through the front door at 6:40 in the evening, tan, relaxed, carrying that particular energy of a man who believes he has gotten away with something. He kissed my cheek. He asked what was for dinner. I told him I had made his favorite, the dish from my grandmother's leather notebook, the one I had made for him since we were 25 years old, and still, after all this time, did not fully know the man eating it across from me. We ate. We talked about ordinary things. A supplier issue at the Jersey location. A new hire we needed to approve in Boston. He was so at ease that I found myself in one strange detached moment, almost admiring the performance. 17 years of marriage, and I had genuinely never watched him lie this comfortably before, sitting 3 feet across from me with our wedding photo hanging on the wall directly behind his head. After dinner, once the plates were cleared, I set a folder on the table between us. Not photographs. I want to be very clear about this, because I know some of you have been waiting for the moment where I slide evidence of the affair across the table and watch his face fall apart. That is not what was in the folder. I did not need it. I had known about Marisol for 11 days by that point, and honestly by then, the affair itself had become the single least interesting thing in the room. The folder held paperwork. The formally restructured operating agreement, dated and filed 6 days earlier. The flagged Miami lease, now requiring my personal signature to move forward. A signature I had absolutely no intention of ever giving. The updated payroll authorization records. A printed summary highlighted in yellow of precisely how much of his company Aaron actually legally controlled after Wilkins finished running the numbers. 11%. And here is the part one promised you at the very beginning of this story, the part where you find out whether it goes where you think it's going to go. Because I know exactly what most of you are expecting right now. You're expecting me to raise my voice. You're expecting tears, maybe a thrown plate, a dramatic exit into the night with a suitcase in one hand. If you've made it this far with me, go ahead and subscribe because I want you here for the actual ending, not the one you've probably already written in your head. Aaron opened the folder. I watched his face do the specific thing a face does when the ground turns out to be somewhere entirely different from where he'd left his foot standing. He read it once. Then he read it again, slower, as if a second reading might change the numbers on the page. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time in 17 years of marriage, I watched my husband actually see me. Not the woman who quietly handled numbers in the back office while he handled interviews out front, not the wife who reliably said yes to whatever he had already decided before he'd finished the sentence, but the person who had, in 11 quiet days, calmly and legally taken apart everything he believed he owned. Priya, he started. I can explain. You don't need to, I told him. I already know about Marisol. I've known for 11 days. The only real question left on the table is whether you sign this tonight, quietly, or whether the board finds out on Monday morning exactly why the Miami lease collapsed, and exactly why 11% of the company suddenly has a very public, very embarrassing reason to be looking for a buyer. I wish I could tell you he fought. He didn't, not really. Men like Aaron are excellent at offense and remarkably underpracticed at defense, because for 17 years, he had simply never once needed to defend anything. He signed that night, at the kitchen table where we had eaten dinner 2 hours earlier, under the wedding photo he'd chosen the frame for himself. By the end of that month, Aaron's 11% had been bought out, fairly legally at a figure Wilkins calculated down to the dollar, a number that was generous by any reasonable standard and that Aaron, notably, did not argue with because arguing would have required him to look more closely at paperwork he had never once bothered to read carefully. He moved to Miami permanently within 6 weeks. As far as I know, he and Marisol are still together, and the two of them have started a small hospitality consulting business that has nothing to do with restaurants, because it turned out, in every way that legally mattered, restaurants had never really belonged to him at all. They had belonged to me, on paper and in practice, for 17 years. He simply had never once thought to check. By the end of that month, Aaron's 11% had been bought out, fairly legally at a figure Wilkins calculated down to the dollar, a number that was generous by any reasonable standard and that Aaron, notably, did not argue with because arguing would have required him to look more closely at paperwork he had never once bothered to read carefully. He moved to Miami permanently within 6 weeks. As far as I know, he and Marisol are still together, and the two of them have started a small hospitality consulting business that has nothing to do with restaurants, because it turned out, in every way that legally mattered, restaurants had never really belonged to him at all. They had belonged to me on paper and in practice for 17 years. He simply had never once thought to check. I let the Miami lease he'd been so quietly proud of collapse under his name that spring. 3 months later, I quietly re-signed the exact same space under my own name, with Denise as my investor once again, just as she had been at the very beginning. Marisol notably stopped answering calls from anyone associated with our company somewhere around that same time. I don't know what became of the details between them after that, and honestly by that point it had stopped being any of my concern. I still make my grandmother's recipe every single Sunday. I still believe even now in real partnership, the kind built on actual trust rather than assumed trust, which I have come to understand are two very different things that only look alike from the outside. I have simply gotten considerably better in the years since at reading the fine print of my own life. Here is the part one promised you at the very top of this story. When I first read that message at 11:47 p.m., I genuinely believed I already knew how this story was going to end. I thought it would end with me broken. I thought it might end with me screaming into an empty kitchen. If I'm honest with you, some small, tired part of me even expected it to end with me quietly forgiving him, the way I had absorbed 100 smaller disappointments over 17 years, because the alternative had always felt in the moment like burning down something I had spent my entire adult life carefully building brick by brick. I did not expect it to end with me keeping everything I had built, and simply, calmly, legally removing the one person who had never fully understood how much of it had been mine to begin with. I am 45 years old. I run 14 restaurants, soon to be 15, in a Miami space that once belonged on paper only to another man's promises. I still believe deep down in love. I have just become considerably more careful about which parts of my life I allow to depend on it, and which parts one make absolutely certain belong to me alone, on paper in ink with my name on every single line that matters. If there is one thing I hope you carry with you out of this story, it is this: the people who love to talk the loudest about everything they're going to build are very rarely the ones actually holding the paperwork that says who owns it. Check the paperwork. Always, always check the paperwork. If this story hits something in you, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel before you go. I've got more stories exactly like this one lined up, and trust me, the next one goes even further than you're expecting.